I'd like to welcome everyone to the My Horse University and eXtension HorseQuest live webinar on giving your horse the best chance during disasters. Our presenters for this evening are Karen Waite and Scott Cotton. Karen is an equine extension specialist at Michigan State University and teaches and advises equine students in the MSU Department of Animal Science. In her extension roles, she coordinates the Adult Equine Extension Program, the Michigan Equine Survey, and is the Director of Leadership Development for My Horse University. In addition, she oversees the Youth Equine Extension Program and is active with eXtension HorseQuest. Scott is a University of Wyoming area agriculture educator and extension disaster education delegate. His experience of working over 2 decades with 3 various land-grant universities is combined with his previous experience as a deputy sheriff, firefighter, and EMT that led him to an active role in managing animal and agriculture disaster response efforts on a number of regional and national wildfires, floods, and severe winter storms. Please note that you are able to ask questions during the presentation via the chat at the bottom of your screen. There will also be time at the end of the presentation for additional questions. And at this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to
Welcome, everybody. We're glad you're here.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Oh, Laura says yes. Excellent. Well, it's wonderful to see so many of you from so many different parts of the country. This is really exciting and a great way to get started on our first webinar of our webcast season. We usually take a little time off during the summer because most people are doing things with their horses, but now it's fall again and we are ready to go with our webinars. So as we start, the first thing we are going to do is to give you a little poll. So the first question, having a hard time with this mouse here, is this: do you think you're ready for a disaster? So when you're ready, go ahead and vote. And you can watch the tally change. And it looks like the majority of you are saying no, you don't think you're necessarily ready for a disaster, and that's understandable. I don't know that any of us can really be completely ready for a disaster, but hopefully tonight's webinar will help you as you become more prepared. So the first thing to consider is that each year we've had thousands of horses and owners that have been impacted by floods, wildfires, tornadoes, diseases, and all kinds of other disasters. I know in Michigan last year, it's still fresh in my mind, the number of ice storms we had and the times that we were affected by ice storms, especially when we were without power for weeks and sometimes 2 or 3 weeks, last December especially. And I think that really got people's attention with regards to the kinds of things they needed to be ready for. Having generators, for example, and making sure that those generators were wired and prepared to run wells so that people could get water to their horses. That was a huge situation for many. So it really depends on what part of the country you're in as to what sort of disaster you'll experience. I know we've had floods in all parts of the country, it seems, and it looks like we're only going to have more and more interesting weather going forward. And I'm sure Scott will talk about much of what's impacted Wyoming from a disaster perspective. One of the things I learned is as we were preparing for this and as I've been working with Scott is the difference between an emergency and a disaster. And it's important to keep that distinction in your mind as we go forward. So an emergency is something that impacts you or a small number of people. I know in my estimation with my own horses, just about every emergency probably feels like a disaster in my mind, but a true disaster is something that overwhelms the resources or the ability to handle it. So during those ice storms I mentioned last December, it wasn't just my family and my farm that was impacted by the lack of power. And fortunately, my husband's a pretty smart fella, but when we built our new house, he insisted on wiring the generator, and it was an extra $3,000, but we were feeling pretty good about ourselves that we had that generator and that it kicked on and we were able to handle things. So that's the difference between an emergency and a disaster. But awareness is definitely the key to survival in any disaster situation. And a horse's ability to survive is going to depend on two things: their natural instincts and the owner's readiness. And that's where this webinar can hopefully help. So, if you're in a disaster situation, you have less than 20 minutes. Do you really think that you're ready to take care of your horses and survive that situation? And what we hope to do with this webinar is start the process so that you can get ready for the disasters that can hit horses and impact them. Dr. Kamansky has commented in the chat box here that they in California had floods recently and were able to take their horses to Pomona, California Fairgrounds at the racetrack. And he says they were so lucky to have this option. The animals were also able to be housed at the LA County Fairgrounds near his home. And he just wanted to share that knowing the local resources and the places you can go are critical. And we are going to definitely talk about that. And that's a great lead-in. It's like Dr. Kamansky knew what the next slide was. So it's important to make a plan, know where you can go, and share it. So as horse owners, we should have and develop a disaster plan with primary and alternative actions. Where are you going to go? How fast can you get there? Your plan should be shared with family and neighbors and people at least 1 hour away. You may have to go at least an hour or more to get to a safe area, and just giving some thought to where that area might be and possibly more than one area, because you may not be able to get to your primary location or the location you thought you were going to get to. So this plan should include all of the elements that we'll talk about today and potential destination locations for shelter and possible evacuation routes. Dr. Kamansky mentioned two different options that they had, and they were very, very fortunate to have those two options. And it's definitely an important part of horse ownership to know where you might go and how you might get there. And if you think you're going to need help, so just as an example, if you don't have a large enough horse trailer, which it would be encouraged that you had a large enough horse trailer to move your animals, if not in one trip, then two at the most, if you can. But if you need to borrow a horse trailer from someone, you need to have that option in mind, or where you're going to go and where you're going to get that trailer from, for sure. So those sorts of things should be planned in advance. I'm going to now turn it over to Scott.
As Dr. Waite indicated, there's a lot of advantages into making a plan, and that should include knowing your risk. One of the biggest elements, especially if you've moved recently, is to learn what the risks are in your dominant area, and it could involve a number of different things. If you move, of course, into a forested area, or if you moved into an area that's rural with less number of accessible roads, you should know that. So when you're dealing with everything from hurricanes, ice storms, tornadoes, blizzards, wildfires, floods, and even the sneaky disasters like heat waves and droughts, it's really important that you have some options. We've always had kind of a 3-option approach when we talk to folks about it from emergency services. And the first one's defend in place. If you're capable to stay where you are safely, you need to have plans and some type of mechanism to do that. Each type of disaster has different requirements, of course. If you have high ground and there's a water issue, you may be fine. If you have wildfire approaching, your options are probably dramatically reduced. Exit A and exit B are simply the mindset that Sometimes disasters have a rude nature of destroying all of your plans. General Eisenhower once said planning is essential, but a plan is worthless. And that kind of follows up on the old adage that the plan only lasts till the first shot's fired. Disasters are like that. When you have a plan, have a backup plan, maybe even two alternatives. It's really important that you have some plans. Along Dr. Kamansky's comments, there's been two disasters where we planned on using fairgrounds or racetracks only to find out that they were occupied or you couldn't use them because of the disaster impact. So it's always advisable to have more than one plan. Back to Dr. Waite. Oh, I didn't mention.
Don't forget.
Yeah, we don't, even though we study for it, we don't worry too much about tsunamis in Wyoming.
Okay. So can you still hear me okay? I hope so. Just give me a yes if you can. Very good. Thank you, Ginger. Hey, Ginger's from Michigan. Nice to see you, Ginger. All right. So when you're dealing with a horse-related disaster, you definitely want to have a good, solid understanding of horse behavior. And by this, I mean horse behavior not just in normal situations, but the fact that horses behave much, much differently in emergency situations. They're scared, their natural instincts take over. So even the calmest, quietest, most well-behaved horse can suddenly get panicky, confused, assertive, aggressive. All of these things can come up, and you need to understand that and potentially be prepared for the fact that horse that you have such a solid, good relationship and bond with um, may have its natural instincts kick in. So many times horse owners aren't really experienced in handling distraught or panicked horses. So when horses get really scared, a lot of times their natural instinct is to flee, to get away from the situation, and to get away from you. So staying calm yourself, making sure that you're breathing and that you're staying calm and being assertive with your horses. Notice I didn't say aggressive, I said assertive. So you're the leader and you're going to help them get out of this situation. And a lot of times, as long as you stay calm and can control your own emotions and breathing through this situation, they'll pick up on that. And that'll be an extremely helpful skill for you to learn. Another thing that you can do is practice moving and loading horses at all hours. So in the dark, early in the morning, times when they're expecting to be fed, potentially changing up the situation a little bit so that they do understand that sometimes their routine is going to be disrupted, especially if there's the potential for disaster. They are definitely going to respond differently to different noises and different noise levels, different conditions. All of these things can potentially impact your horse's behavior. So horses are panicky and confused in smoke and fire situations. And sometimes in the event of a barn fire or, another type of fire that's encompassing even more, their natural response oftentimes is to run back into the barn. So anyone who's had horses for any length of time has learned that once you take a horse out of a barn that's burning, you need to secure them somewhere else so that they can't get back into the barn, because a lot of times that's what they'll try to do. With a flood situation, horses naturally will try to move away from the water. So they'll try to get to higher ground if they can. So if you're leaving horses or if you know the area is going to flood and you have higher ground between or in other pastures, keeping the gates open so that they can move around on their own is definitely a good way to handle that, and let them use their natural instincts if you can. Seismic events or earthquakes, we've had some of those of late. I know California has had a very large one or a larger one than they've had in quite some time in the last couple of weeks. This confuses horses, just like it confuses everyone else, basically. So they can get panicky in those situations too, and not quite understand. And as humans, one of the things we often try to do with panicked horses is go in and try to soothe them or calm them, and really know your animals and know if that's a good idea based on the situation. Sometimes you walk into a stall and they're so panicked they may run over you trying to get out of the stall. So it's just keep in mind that it's not them. They're not trying to go after you. They're just nervous, concerned, and they're trying to save themselves. Storms have a pretty unique impact on horses as well. And this is true even in a non-disaster situation. If you watch horses in just your garden variety rainstorm, it's very common for them to turn away from the wind, turn their tails to the wind, and they will all do it. And a lot of times they're perfectly comfortable. That's their natural instinct. That's their natural behavior. They don't mind being in the rain. They just want to have the option of turning their tails to the wind. I was judging a horse show about 3 weeks ago, and we had a major downpour kick up fairly quickly, and the horses started to trot in, and it looked like everything was going to be okay, and then it just started to pour. And I looked down the pen and I thought, I didn't see any lightning or anything, and I thought, well, we might be able to try to get through this. And pretty soon I looked down the rail, and 2 or 3 of them had already turned and had just stopped. They were going nowhere, and the horses had turned their tails. So I thought, okay, we're not going to do this. So we postponed the horse show for a little while. Sometimes hail would be the one situation that it's difficult for horses to get away from. They sometimes will come out of their shelters into the hail and potentially get hurt. I think the noise probably gets them stressed and they leave, or they'll try to come out because they don't want to deal with the sound of the hail, or they're concerned about the sound of the hail. But other times, as Dr. Skelly had mentioned, sometimes horses will go back in the barn as a result of hail. So it really just depends on the horses. You have to know the animals that you're working with. But one thing you want to consider on your property or in your farm is, again, and this is part of knowing your horses, is understanding both the mobility level of the horse. So if you have an extremely old horse that has problems moving, you have to consider that, how well they potentially can get away from the flood or whatever it is, and making sure that they have an easy path to getting out of the property if they need to, or out of the area if they need to. That's going to be, again, different from horse to horse, clearly, but making sure there's an easy exit from the property is an important tip, and knowing your horses and how well they can move. If you can, be sure to prepare your horses to move. If you have the time, you may be able to sacrifice any kind of preparation in regards to clearing the area and getting the horses out. You could take that time and actually move the horses to a safe location, rather than spend a lot of time trying to clear the exits or that sort of thing, so to speak. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Scott.
Dr. Waite mentioned the need for help at times, and manpower is a critical issue, especially in times of disasters and when horses are distraught. It's not uncommon at all to find that the people that own horses in an impact zone don't have enough help to successfully evacuate or manage horses in the site. Horses by nature, when they're distraught, it takes a certain skill set, a certain ability level, agility level, and mobility level by everybody working with them. We've often found that, as indicated in the notes, people have a plan to have friends come help them. But I can tell you, as one of those people that spent time behind a badge at a road stop, a lot of those people won't get there because it won't be allowed into the impact area, leaving you short-handed. And that's important that you understand that that may happen when you have a disaster or even an emergency with horses. The horse-wise resources that I mentioned, they should be able to get you in 20 minutes. Often as not, the road closures will start happening within 30 minutes. As soon as authorities realize that life safety of humans is getting to be an issue, they'll start shutting those road closures down. So if you have capable people that understand handling horses in a distraught situation, it's important that you visit with them. We have found, as a person who's coordinated evacuation teams, that ag producers, horse stable owners, and rodeo contractors are some of the most experienced and adept at handling horses under stress rapidly and safely. And safely is a big issue because of the number of risks that the human handlers undertake when they do that. Back to you, Karen.
All right, it's time for another poll. So everybody get ready. And I'll struggle with the mouse again. So this question is, do you think that you have the right equipment to deal with a disaster? So everybody take a few seconds and see what you think. Okay, so we've got somewhere near 70% who feel like no, they potentially don't, and about 33-ish. All right, so my rounding isn't very good. So 33% say yes, they're definitely confident that they have the right equipment, and 66.67 say no, they're pretty sure that they don't. So let's talk about that just a little bit. And I will hide the poll. All right, so we want to make sure as part of your plan that owners have access to equipment to be able to relocate all their horses within 30 minutes to 3 hours, depending on the incident. And I have to admit, I'm guilty of this. I have a 2-horse trailer, and right now I have 3 horses at home. So I do think about that periodically. I probably will use it as part of my marketing campaign to convince my husband that we should get a 3-horse trailer. But I don't know that that will work very well either because I actually own 4, and at some point the 4th one will probably come home. But either way, it's important to keep that equipment in good working order to make sure that you can access it. My poor husband also does not understand why I came home sometime this summer and we had a load of dirt and he had dropped the load of dirt right in front of my trailer. And of course, I want to be able to easily access that trailer, not just in the event of a disaster, but in the event of a medical emergency. So let's say I had a colic and I needed to get someone back to the university. I'd need to be able to get at that trailer. The good news was he had every intention of moving the dirt, and he doesn't do that very often, so the dirt was cleared within 6 hours. But those are all things to think about periodically because you really just never know what you're going to have to deal with when you have horses. You do want to make sure that your equipment is maintained and ready for the worst possible conditions. So it's also important to know that whatever truck you're going to haul your trailer with will start in any occasion, but making sure that it's ready for any kind of conditions. It's critical in your disaster plan. And making sure you have fuel available. I know during the ice storms, there were long, long lines for fuel. A lot of that fuel was going to generators as opposed to vehicles. But when we heard or started to realize that we were about to get hit pretty hard, long lines came. So if you have the ability to access fuel or to have it on hand, you definitely should do that and should plan for that. Facility-wise, owners should very clearly understand the durability of their facilities, their ability to withstand um, disasters, and at what level they might be able to withstand those disasters. It's really surprising for some people. They think they've got, and I don't know what it is about existing horse facilities, but we have a lot of horse facilities that seem to have been built in the absolute lowest part of the property. And it doesn't matter what part of the country you're in, it happens. Um, and that's pretty well and good most of the time, but in a flooding situation, that's where the water goes. A week or two ago at the MSU Horse Teaching and Research Center, we have our new facility that's up on higher ground, but we have a very old historic barn that sits in a low spot on the property, and we got probably 2 or 3 inches of rain very, very quickly. And the lower barn flooded. That's the first time I've ever seen it flood. But it was full. And so fortunately it happened during the day. Fortunately, we had students working there and they were able to broom a lot of it out pretty quickly. But when you look at your property someday or sometimes look at it from a disaster perspective. Remember to shut down the power and gas for certain kinds of disasters. Tornadoes might be one example of that. And also know where you go to shut down the power. Sometimes people don't necessarily know how to go about doing that. So the time to try to figure it out is not when you're faced with a disaster situation. And we had mentioned too earlier, opening the gates between the pastures if you're staying in place or your horses are, so that horses have the option of moving away from risks. The one exception there might be hail. They may or may not, as I've seen in the chat pod there, they may or may not move away from it. Sometimes they'll run out of the shelters in the cases of hail or anything that's causing excessive noise on the roof may cause them to start to panic. And now I'm turning it over to Scott.
All right, thank you. I've had sad experiences with that, with 4 horses that were driven out by hail after they went into a barn. And of course, as horses do, they went right down to the farthest corner away from the storm, turned their tails to it. And the group of 30-some horses, the hail hit them so hard that 4 of them had to be put down. So it does happen. Partly, it's mostly to do with metal roofs. And as many of you are aware, pole barns by nature are one of the most common horse barns, and they often have metal roofs that make a pretty loud noise when they have large hail hit them. So let's talk about roles and responsibilities. It's important as horse owners that we understand that you're responsible for yourself if you stay in an impact area, but also for your animals. There's certain codes and regulations that require you to take some prudent measures to take care of your animals. And if you ask authorities, often they'll help, but they're going to pour all of their resources into life, human safety first. And once those are addressed, then they may swing resources to help us with animals and livestock. So just remember that they come second, even though in your heart they might come first. If you get evacuated from an area without your horses, or you get caught in a disaster where you're held out of the area, you may not be allowed to return for some time. It's important, I saw a comment in the chat box earlier, that you learn what the regulations and the guidelines are for your parish or your county or your state, so that you know what rights you have to stay in place, what rights you have to get back into an area, and also what protocols they follow to allow that to happen. Each incident will vary a little bit. The more that you know your local resources, the more that you're active in the community, there's more likelihood that they'll be allowed back into an area with certain conditions met. So just to understand that before you get involved with something. Karen?
On that same note, I think it's important that horse owners understand, and honestly, I had horses for a very, very long time, but until I started working more with first responders and some of those situations, there really is a very specific order of business when it comes to a disaster. They, the first responders and law enforcement, and Scott can certainly talk to this quite extensively, there is a specific hierarchy, just like there's a hierarchy in your horse herd, there's a hierarchy and a plan that goes in place, or if an emergency or disaster situation starts, there's an incident commander who's in charge, and everyone who is involved in law enforcement or disaster response knows their role and knows what's acceptable and what's not. And so their job is to try to protect human life and to bring some order to the situation. And so, like Scott said, we care about and want the best for our animals, whether they're horses or dogs or cats or anything else. But at the same time, those people have a job to do. And so, and the job they're trying to do is to protect human life and to bring order to a otherwise chaotic situation. So as you get involved in your community and start to learn more about disaster situations, you'll likely learn more about the process that goes into handling a disaster. Um, but the things to understand, and CNN has done a really good job, and any news organization, I shouldn't pick on CNN probably, but they've done a great job of showing us pictures of people who have decided not to evacuate in horrific situations, and talking to those people, and the stories are sometimes pretty sad. But it's important to understand your rights in these kinds of situations. So you definitely have the right not to evacuate. You can potentially stay where you are and with your animals, but you do not necessarily have the right to follow up priority assistance should you choose to stay. So keep that in mind. And I remember hearing news stories and seeing people who chose to do that during Hurricane Sandy, who had been through a lot of hurricanes, but had never been through one like that, and were quite traumatized by the fact that they couldn't get help following that situation. If you do have your horses taken to a community grounds or a location, um, you do need to keep in mind that they're trying to take care of everyone's horses in that situation, and they're doing the best that they can. But the horses will get a basic level of care. So that may be in groups. They're probably not going to get special attention in regards to supplements or those sorts of things. It's difficult to group feed horses very specific supplements or diets. And so they'll probably not get special attention feeding or handling. But thankfully, they likely will receive basic feed, water, care, and the things that you may not be able to provide for them during that disaster situation, because you're also dealing with your human family and trying to keep things going there. You absolutely have the right to reclaim your animals after you have placed them in a shelter situation, but you have to also understand that you need to be able to identify those animals to claim them. So um, we will talk pretty extensively about the kinds of things and the kinds of documentation that you can have that will help you be able to reclaim those animals. So during the documentation, as we discussed in the very beginning, sometimes moving horses in or out of a situation might be more difficult than normal hauling. So animals that normally load and unload quite easily might be more inclined not to do so. But keeping this kind of documentation in your trailer will be extremely handy when you go to having to reclaim them, should you find yourself in that situation. So keeping color copies of ownership and registration papers, having plenty of pictures of your horses from all sides potentially, Color copies of your ID will be useful. And making sure, a lot of times people will buy registered horses and never transfer them. That is less helpful when you go to try to reclaim your animal with a color copy of your ID with your name on it when your name is not on the horse's papers. So for most associations, it's pretty inexpensive to make that transfer and get those papers updated so that your name's on them. I've talked to so many people who have not, and not always in disaster situations, but who have never bothered to transfer their animals. And that's one piece of paper. Granted, it typically will have a pretty extensive description. It's just description of markings, but if it's got your name on it, that will help tremendously when you go to reclaim those animals. Having the contact information for veterinarians, stables in the area, where your destinations are going to be, potential directions. If you find yourself in a situation where Google Maps or your GPS system of choice isn't working, you will potentially be in a bind in that regard. So sometimes good old-fashioned paper can be helpful. I see Sheila has mentioned making sure that you have a Coggins test. And a Coggins test will have that. One thing that you can do to even further strengthen your case in regards to the idea that this is your horse is if you put the registered name on the Coggins test and have the registration papers with both the registered name of the horse and your name on the registration documents. Now you've got 3 different pieces of identification or 3 different pieces of paper that tie that horse to you. If you're further out west, brand inspection and health inspection copies will help you or will serve the same purpose in regards to identification. And then making sure that you have a flash drive with all of these things, potential scanned copies of all of these things will be useful as well.
I would like to add to Dr. Waite's comments, having handled animal issues on a number of disasters, we've seen a lot of horses that were stolen during disasters and had difficulty tracking where they went and who had them, and have developed law enforcement techniques for recovering those animals, but we don't get them all back. Partly it's due to the fact that when a disaster happens, the first priority is to get all the humans and all the animals out of the impact area. And at times, novice law enforcement at the road stops do not know how to identify horses. So we've developed some protocols for law enforcement to deal with that. But it is important that you know that you need to be able to identify your horse clearly, because we've had people check horses out of shelters that appeared to be the owners and it ended up not being. So it's important that we restrict who can take horses out and make sure it's appropriate. I always advocate people to make a laminated list and stick it on the inside door of your horse trailer. I became big on lamination when I was an EMT, when I realized that you can make a chart, write on it with a Sharpie, and it didn't matter if it was raining, snowing, on fire or whatever. It was permanent until you wiped it off with alcohol. And it's really handy when the balloon goes up, is the phrase we use. When the balloon goes up and you realize that you left your wallet, you left your phone, or worse yet, you find out that the phone circuits on the microwave towers are so congested your cell phone is worthless, that you have a list that includes things to do, places to go, and what you need to load. So that's why I call this the list, because everybody panics during the disaster. It's just important to remember to get to really important things. They have the capacity to make everyone miss everyday steps. I have seen law enforcement officers drive out without their weapons. I have seen EMTs run out without their boots. I mean, it happens to people that handle emergencies all the time. If you're not used to it, it's even worse. If you put that list on the inside of your trailer, I think the first thing you should put at the very top of it is stop and think, because 5 minutes of thinking can save you literally weeks of problems later if you try to do that. Karen?
And one thing, Scott had mentioned the possibility of the cell phone being worthless. And one thing I always forget, and I'm notorious for having a phone that runs out of battery at the most inopportune times. But the other thing I do is that I have, just like most of you probably do, most of my phone numbers for the people I would call are in my cell phone. So if my phone is no longer any good or I haven't taken the charger, um, I'm kind of up the literal creek because I can't access people's phone numbers. So we've gotten out of the habit a lot of times of not writing down phone numbers, but that would be a definite good thing to add to your list is, phone numbers of relatives or people whose numbers you may not actually have except for in your cell phone. So safety checks, making sure that the trailer is hooked up correctly and the gates closed when you are trying to haul horses in this situation. I know sometimes when you, especially with a bumper pull trailer, making sure that that little, I'm sure it has a very technical name, but that little do-girder that you use to lock the hitch down on the ball, if you're in a hurry, you may not lock that, or you may drop the ball onto or drop the hitch onto the ball and basically forget to lock it, forget to hook up the chains if you've got safety chains. So make sure that the gates on the trailer are closed. You're going to be in a hurry. So you really have to take a moment and double check everything because it would be even worse to be in this kind of situation and then have to deal with a trailer accident. So making sure that the horses are loaded securely and that they're um, ready to go in the trailer, making sure that you have the feed, the tack you're going to need, if any, but primarily the feed and all the paperwork that we've discussed here. Um, Making sure that you've notified your friends of plans, if you can. If you're in the situation where you're trying to get out or away from home, making sure that someone knows that that's your plan and where you're headed, how you're trying to get there, will be useful in the event that you do run into a problem or they have to look for you later. At least someone knows how you were trying to get out and where you were trying to go. Making sure that you have enough fuel. This is another thing, even with my everyday car, that I am not as good about as I should be. But making sure that you have enough gas to get um, your truck and trailer away from the situation if possible, or into a safer scenario. Whatever belongings you're planning to take, making sure that you have all of those things. And again, some cash and your phone charger. I would definitely add phone charger to this list of activities or this list of items that you have to take with you, because it may be a long time before you can get to your local store that sells phone chargers. So double check your list. Again, you have to, despite the fact that you're in a very scary situation, you have to try to manage your emotions and double check everything you can. So what supplies do you need on our Caballos list here? That will be our horse list. You need feed, tack, buckets, the paperwork, some basic first aid equipment, any medications that they might need that you may be able to deliver to them, um, water, a supply of water. Sometimes horses will be finicky with regards to the water that they're interested, or if it's unfamiliar water, some horses won't drink it. So you may want to take a supply of your own water if you can, if you have that luxury, or if you have a water tank, and then anything else you think your horse might need. A lot of us keep many of these things already in the trailer. Typically they're to take horses to shows or events, but oftentimes buckets, first aid equipment, medications, The water tank, you might have one in the trailer and one in the barn. So that'll definitely make getting out of there a little quicker, just by having the trailer stocked for your usual events. But there'll be other things that you might not typically take to the horse show or trail ride or whatever you're doing. The things that the human will need will include some clothes, your medications, if there are any. As horse owners, we're also notorious for taking better care of our animals than we do ourselves. So if you have medications that you need to make sure you take, uh, being sure you have those, paperwork, money and phone, um, any bedding, a sleeping bag you might need if you're lucky enough to have a living quarters trailer and can get to a situation. Some of these things will already be there, but not all of them. Food and water, first aid supplies, and then radio and potential light sources that you might need depending on what the disaster is and where you're headed. Just a couple of tips. Sometimes horse owners who travel a lot will use Gatorade or some of those kinds of powders to mask the smell of the water so it smells basically the same everywhere. You don't want horses to stop drinking ever, but in a stressful or unfamiliar environment, they may do that. So nothing causes an impaction colic more quickly than lack of water. So making sure that they're consuming water, consuming enough water, so 10 to 15 gallons a day in regular average environment or average temperature um, is fairly normal for a 1,000-pound horse at maintenance anyway. So keeping an eye on that to the extent you're able, watching horses closely for interactions with new horses. All horses who are interacting or who are introduced to new horses will have skirmishes. And I can't tell you the number of calls I get from boarders, especially who are upset because their horse has gotten bit or kicked or something by a new horse who has been introduced to the herd, and somehow this new horse is potentially a bad horse. Well, they're not. Horses are herd animals. They have dominance hierarchies. And so whenever you introduce a new one to other new ones, there's the potential for skirmishes. So left to their devices for a long enough period of time, they will work that out. But you do need to keep an eye on all of the horses for potential wounds or cuts or kicks. But unfortunately, that is part of having horses in groups. So making sure you have enough first aid items handy to cover whatever might come up. And then cleaning your horses as soon as possible after a disaster. They need that grooming will help them. It probably will help you as well. We know that this kind of interaction with animals, horses, dogs, and several others, will lower your blood pressure in as little as 15 minutes. So cleaning your horses, grooming your horses, trying to help them feel like they're getting back to a normal routine after a disaster situation will help. And looking for resources for horses, no matter where you are, is a good way to be vigilant as you're going through this kind of situation. And then when you go home, you'll be so happy to be home, most likely, and the horses probably will be too if the disaster is now over and they're back in a familiar environment. But make sure you walk your fences, do a safety check before you turn them loose. It's possible that a gate may have gotten open that you didn't know was open, or a tree may have fallen on a fence. We had a storm last week, and sure enough, we had a tree that had fallen. Fortunately, it was on our arena fence, so there wasn't um, any concern there. But always making sure we had another storm last November, and we had one horse that was outside 24/7, but I decided based on the weather forecast to put her in And I was never so glad to have put her in because when I walked out in the morning, the fence in her lot had come down during the storm. So, that would have been the middle of the night in horrific weather. So sometimes, if you have the option of putting them in, that is definitely a good way to go, but making sure you check your surroundings closely before turning the horses loose is always a good idea. So we've got plenty of resources. And I will turn this over.
A couple other thoughts on the items. The carrying some of your own water is always a good idea, especially if you're defending in place or you're headed for a destination that may be affected by the disaster. Also, sometimes the water that you find at locations that you drive to is not potable or safe. And that fills into the same comment about grooming your horses. Often as not, there's contaminants involved with disasters of certain types, whether they're waterborne or airborne, and it's always a good idea to get those contaminants off your horse as well as using it for a calm down and quiet down period. The Gatorade trick is obviously not going to be something that you can get a horse used to in a short period of time, but if there's a large storm or a hurricane coming and you have 2 or 3 days notice, you can put a little bit in their water, and then when you go to a new location, they'll smell it. But the secondary benefit is it provides electrolytes that they are going to lose rapidly when they're stressed anyway. Some of the resources we want to make sure that you guys know of, in addition to the Horse University and the Horse Quest team on the extension, there's other resources on the Eden system, which is the Extension Disaster Education Network. One of the programs involved with that, the SCAP program, Strengthening Community Agro-Security Preparedness, actually goes into communities and helps emergency managers visit with folks like you, like horse owners, to help develop better plans for livestock, animals, and horses if they have an incident. And then FEMA has been working on animal emergencies for a long time, and it all dovetails together. So our contact information is right there, and you're always welcome. I believe Karen would mirror my comment. You can always email us or contact us, and there's a great team of people with Horse Quest and the Horse University that have a wide variety of knowledge. And then on the actual been in the mud and the snow and the smoke and stuff, there's a team on my side that's available to send answers and information also. Any other thoughts, Karen?
Yeah. No, I think you definitely covered it. And we, again, are always willing to and happy to try to help. So please keep our contact information handy. We've got a couple comments in the chat box regarding being aware of the closest hospital. Blair was actually injured in an emergency situation and was not able to find a hospital. So having some idea of the closest hospital and the direction that you're headed is definitely going to be helpful. Do we have any other questions that people have thought of as we've gone through this information? Go ahead and share those in the chat box if you do, but you've had some great comments to this point and some good discussion.
I was watching your comments and conversation about chip readers, and I have to share with you that in over 60 instances where I've been involved in emergency services or shelters, there was never a chip reader available. So it's a great idea, but a lot of those people don't remember to bring them when there's a disaster.
Okay, we have one question here. The first one I saw is, do you suggest we leave halters on horses? And unfortunately, the response to that question is going to be, it depends on the situation. More often than not, the answer to that is we'd rather you didn't leave halters on horses. And in typical turnout situations, we suggest you don't leave halters on horses. But this is a little bit different. You're going to have panicked animals potentially. It depends on, if do we leave halters on horses when they're turned loose in groups in a sheltering environment? Maybe. depending on the fencing and how many people are around to see them. If you need to get a horse out in a hurry and they're difficult to halter, then in that scenario, keeping the halter on is a good idea. The halter can also potentially provide identification information, but with the embroidered halters, you can keep your phone up. Maybe you have emergency halters, or you have leather halters, which will break more often than not if they get hung up on something. That's what we always suggest, is that leather will ultimately break. You could have a nameplate or a contact plate on that leather halter, but again, if they get into a situation where the halter breaks and falls off, then they're no longer identified. So I didn't give you a straight answer. It depends on the situation.
I agree. Whether in areas of timber, I suggest getting them off if you have timber or brush, because often it's not we find them snagged or they have an injury, like the vet mentioned, where a branch ran under it or they kicked at something and another horse kicked and caught, or a barbed wire fence caught the halter. But at the same time, my greatest nightmare, and it's happened a number of times, is to have somebody send one of my teams in to get horses, and then tell you on the phone that they're not halter broke or trailer broke, and you got volunteers going in to get them. It's quite a Donnybrook when you get there, so you still try to do it. But can I speak to the tornado issue? If you have a tornado warning, my suggestion is have a big enough pasture that you can turn the horses loose and they can move away from it. Even an F5 is only a mile wide. Most tornadoes are less than a half a mile wide. If horses have the room to move away from a tornado, they will do so. They're very adept at sensing air pressure changes, and they will move away from them. If you're in a confined area and a tornado's in the area, you've only got a limited amount of time. It's kind of a judgment call. But I prefer to have horses on bigger acreages so they have some natural instinct ability to avoid impacts.
Back to the identification question that we had a little earlier, and potentially the halter. If you have noticed, well, maybe you haven't, but in your local farm store, they sell what amounts to wax crayons, or they look like big crayons for identifying animals, hogs or cattle or that sort of thing. Those also will work on horses. So if you're needing to either put your phone number on a horse, or your name, or some kind of identifying, it's not going to last forever, but it'll help.
We actually instruct firefighters that if they can't evac a horse, we've been issuing those crayons, livestock crayons, to the teams out here in the West and telling them to write the address on the horse and then turn it loose.
I think we had a couple questions. I'm trying to keep up with them. I know somebody had mentioned making sure that your horse has a tetanus shot, and keeping that updated. That is critical in tornadoes or disasters where they have the potential to get cut or puncture wounds. A tetanus shot it's inexpensive. We know it works. So making sure your horses are boosted for tetanus every year is key. Francine has mentioned that she often sees horse eye injuries after high wind events. So just keeping that in mind. Francine, do you have suggestions for how to help prevent those? And again, everything you put on them is potentially something that they can get hooked on later. But if they're used to wearing fly masks, that might be one thing that will help. I know Audrey had a question regarding, are there differences in weanlings and babies when getting them to safety? Absolutely, because this is a lot of times they may be minimally halter broke, or just halter broke, or halter broke in calm environments. So they are going to respond a little differently. They may become extremely agitated, or sometimes young horses will really look to you for help. They're babies, they're scared, they're going to look to somebody for help. And if you're the somebody, then they're going to rely on you to get them to safety. So it's a little difficult to predict, but the likelihood that they're going to be more agitated is definitely there, and that their halter braking may not be as solid. So it just depends. All right, vaccinations and some discussion regarding the tornadoes and getting yourself to the nearest shelter. That is the added advantage of having large acreage. Unfortunately, as far as being able to turn your horses loose, in Michigan, we have quite a few farms that are, I wouldn't call them farms. They're 10 acres or less, and they have horses, but the usable acreage for animals is fairly confined. But yes, if you're in a tornado, you really don't have time to do a lot, for sure. And Francine has added, it's difficult to prevent the eye injuries, but definitely checking the eyes closely after the event is important. Should you try to swim or lead horses if safety is on the other side of a body of water? Um, in that respect, I would say it's going to depend a little bit on how much experience those horses have with water and how deep that water is, if you know. I wouldn't necessarily encourage a human to try to enter a body of water without knowing how deep or how quickly that water is moving. And horses, unless they've been into bodies of water in a normal environment, will find water to be even scarier. So I would say assess the situation, but Scott might have something to add.
I agree. We've even had boat teams, rescue teams that had their Zodiacs pulled over because a horse panicked when they tried to get a hold of horse's halter and help. Horses by nature swim fairly naturally once they get into water, but you need to know the stream really well, and streams change dramatically during floods. There could be debris in it. I would just monitor the horses, and as far as trying to steer them, it's a little tough. We've tried it with a number of different types of livestock without much success. Um, a lot of times it's just better to, unless you're in a situation where they're flowing downstream towards fence lines, which we've actually issued fence pliers to all of our boat teams now to try to get horses clear and stuff like that. Just open the fence up and let them go on downstream to where there's higher ground that they hit. Um, Horses stuck in muds and bogs, that's a technical rescue issue. We have a course for that, but it takes a lot of training and a lot of expertise to prevent people being injured.
All right, great discussion and lots of great comments. Again, we're really excited to have so many people from so many different parts of the country. And on behalf of Scott and myself, I'd like to thank you for attending. And I'm going to turn the mic back over to Gwen, and she'll give you some final details. Thanks, everyone.
All right, well, we definitely like to thank Karen and Scott for your presentation tonight, and for all of you for your good discussion and questions. We really appreciate that as well. We will be sending out a survey, and we're going to try something new this year. When I end the meeting here, it allows me to put in a URL that will show up on your screen, and we're going to try and link directly to our survey to make it really easy for you guys to just give us a little bit of feedback on how we're doing with our webcasts. We will also follow up with an email with a link to the survey in a couple days, so you will be getting it that way as well, but you only have to answer it once. All right, so we also have some upcoming webcasts, and we actually have one coming up this Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And this is kind of a follow-up session by Karen and Scott again. And Scott, if you're still available, would you like to give a little preview of what this webcast will be about?
In reality, the cooperative extension professionals often end up handling a lot of the sheltering, some of the coordination for evacuation, and other issues surrounding horses in disaster. And the target and focus of the webinar on Friday is to give guidance to those extension professionals across the United States so that they have kind of a set of basic rules so that they can help horse owners deal with disasters.
Great, thanks, Scott. We also have our October webcast scheduled for October 14th, and we're going to be hearing from Julie Frischman. She's an equine law practitioner, and she's going to be talking about sales fraud within the horse industry. So this webcast, right now we don't quite have the registration up on the website. We will later on this week, so it'll be open for registration, but you can also learn more about it in our eTips newsletter we send out and so forth. And so you'll be hearing about it there and from our website as well. So once again, feel free to give us any comments or suggestions that you have. You can email us at info@myhorseuniversity.com if you, by chance, are not on our mailing list. And we will just give you information on our courses and webinars and things like that. So once again, we'd like to thank everyone. And the recording for this session will also be put up online as well. Okay, now go here.